Hey guys, what's going on? I'm going to be streaming the you I'm going to be streaming the Google Meet session for Lakewood CERT here in about a minute, and we're just going to have to see how it goes. I also have the scanner going in the background. My computer's being so slow right now. See if this will even work, because right now, as it stands, camera is starting. Ask to join. There we go.
Against a brick, but that's what it is. Hey Kurt, welcome to the meeting. So this is a civil defence helmet from 1982 from Ireland. In case you're wondering, CS does not stand for civil defence. It stands in Gaelic for Cushion Civilta, which is the Gaelic for civil defence. So unless you speak Gaelic, don't worry about it. It's more of an antique at this stage, just like me. Okay, and I'll also show you something else. This is the rear end of the field uniform that civil defence folks would wear back in the 80s. And it's a full coverall. Everybody who was a member got one of these, whether you liked it or not. And you would not be unseen. You would be seen from miles away if you wore one of these. So put yourself in a search for missing person, and you would be spotted way off. The uniforms have changed, but I thought I'd just share it with you so you see some of the stuff that we used to wear back in those days. Does anybody have any questions before I get going, or maybe a different subject you'd prefer to chat about?
Declan, I'm actually not seeing myself here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump out and jump right back in.
Okay. I'm not seeing you either, by the way. So keen to continue on with what is a sort of a civil defence with CERT here in Colorado and in Lakewood, and happy to have you guys part of that. So I'm just going to switch over to present mode, and in a second you should see things change. At any time during this presentation, you are more than welcome to ask questions, either by voice or by chat, whichever you prefer. Although I must admit, I'm not very good at knowing how chat works. So if anybody sees chat, or maybe a hand up, could you please let me know?
I can monitor for you, Declan.
Oh, I really appreciate that, because all I can see at the moment on my screen is actually the presentation. I don't have access to a second screen. So can you confirm to me, Carl, that you see currently a screen that says civil defence?
Yes, sir.
Oh, thank you. And I've no need to call me sir. Last person who called me sir was the Queen of England when she made me a knight, but that was just a daydream. Okay, so here we go. So this is I'll start off the presentation with this slide, because this is just there to illustrate to you something rather special about Irish civil defence, without knowing anything about it. And that is that in Ireland, defence is spelled with a C. So in case you're wondering, did I misspell this? No, I didn't actually. It's spelled the way it's supposed to be spelled in Ireland. Obviously, most other parts of the world, they have an S, but there you go. Defence is spelled with a C in Ireland. And As we're on this slide, I also wanted to point out to you that firstly, the color of the uniform has changed from lime yellow to orange and black, which is far better, I think, for the conditions you experience in Ireland. And they're wearing helmets. So unlike the white one I showed you, they're now wearing a different style of helmet. But notice these volunteers are carrying an equivalent of the stretcher we were teaching people how to use in the wilderness first aid class, which is a sort of a Stokes basket. And in front of them is a pilot who just landed that Coast Guard helicopter. So these are all volunteers, apart from the pilot, he gets paid. And they're engaged in the removal, extrication of a patient from a Coast Guard helicopter. And I just wanted you to see that because it begins the process of explanation for civil defense. It's not considered, as we see here, as being a group of volunteers who can be called upon maybe if, that kind of stuff. They're actually given a very high profile in Ireland and are encouraged to participate in what would appear initially at least to be risky procedures. But of course they get a lot of training. So again, I'm emphasizing that a lot of respect is provided to the members of civil defense in Ireland, and it's 100% volunteer. So let's move on. And also on this slide, you'll see there's that interesting little logo on the bottom right-hand corner, which is the orangey yellow background and the blue triangle. That's the international symbol of civil defense. And you'll see other civil defense organizations in other countries, including FEMA, they incorporate that symbol somewhere into their logo. FEMA is a very, very tiny part of the logo, whereas elsewhere it's much larger and it's typically the orange and blue. So with that, let's move right ahead. So I'm going to start by comparing Ireland to Colorado. For those of you who are not familiar with where Ireland is, it's on the eastern side of the Atlantic Ocean, just pointing it out to you there. The green part is the Republic of Ireland, and in the north of Ireland you see this yellow part, which is actually part of the United Kingdom. That's Northern Ireland. So I'm from the green part, and I'm from just where the tip of the arrow is. I'm from County Clare. But you'll see that when you compare Ireland to Colorado, kind of the same size, but actually Ireland's a little smaller than Colorado. And also this map has some scale issues. But that's where we are. Curious thing about Ireland is that it's surrounded by water. So you can't really escape from Ireland if you're there unless you take a plane or a boat. Whereas obviously in Colorado you can easily drive over the border if you want to into a neighboring state. And then on a similar scale map, you see that Ireland is actually roughly a quarter of the size of Colorado. So I mean the Republic of Ireland here. And at the time of this presentation, the population of Ireland was 4.6 million, which is not too dissimilar to the population of Colorado, which is 5.4 million. So that's interesting, although you might say, well, Colorado's almost 4 times as big as Ireland. But the truth is that if you look at the population of Colorado, you'll see that the majority of folks live in the area surrounding Denver. So the north central region, as you see in the map there, is where the bulk of people live. Obviously also in south central there's a bunch of folks. So when we look at that 5.4 million, I don't know the exact number, but I know that I would say almost 80% of that live in the part of Colorado where we live together. So that actually corresponds more or less to the population of Ireland. And I want you to think of that later because you'll see why. Any questions on this before I go any further? Okay, I'll just continue. Yeah, go ahead, please.
Personal question. Where in Clare? Where are you from?
Well, fortunately, this map on the right includes the town I was born in. Well, the town I was raised in, which is Ennis.
Ennis. I'll be there next month.
Oh, okay. Right. We'll have to have a chat about that offline.
Yeah.
I also spent a considerable amount of time in the coastal part of Clare, which is over here, and learned how to play traditional Irish music over there. So again, we can talk offline about that.
Yeah.
For the benefit of everybody else, I don't want to bore you. Just let you know. So once again, in the previous map, I point out this north central region. This is the area where Denver is located. Some of you, I'm sure you've all heard by now, I'm the chair of the North Central Region Citizen Preparedness Committee, which the grants for volunteer programs in the NCR. But when we compared the NCR North Central region to Ireland, now you begin to see the population similarity. 2.9 million people in the NCR, 4.6 in the Republic of Ireland, which is in pink in this map here on the right. And if we put the North Central region on top of Ireland, very soon you see that there's a lot of similarities. I mean, okay, it's smaller than Ireland, but population-wise, if we were to increase the size of the NCR to include the other population centres to the south of us, we'd soon become very comparable to Ireland. And Dublin, the capital of Ireland, is, by coincidence, starts with a D, is similar to Denver, in that the populations of the two cities are actually very similar. They sound different from the two cities, but in terms of size, they're very, very similar. Of course, Denver does not have an ocean front, which Dublin does. But again, as you'll see in this presentation, sometimes, when we here in the United States, we look at our wonderful country, we think 360 odd million people and all these differences. And I'm just pointing out to you that when you compare the United States to Ireland, Ireland's a tiny country compared to the US, but when you compare Ireland to Colorado, we begin to see some similarities, which again will lend itself to your understanding of how civil defence operates. So let's talk about Ireland first and what the significant hazards are. And I'm drawing upon some of our training in CERT. So Ireland occasionally does get some extreme weather. Ireland on occasion experiences hurricane-like winds coming from the Atlantic Ocean, which is the water mass to the west of Ireland. And they can cause all kinds of problems for people, including mini tsunamis and windstorm events, knocking over trees, buildings, flooding, etc. Which goes on to the second point. Flooding is an inevitability in Ireland, given that it rains all the time, except for 2 weeks in summer when people go there on holidays. And then, curiously enough, Ireland also experiences forest fires. And that's because when it doesn't rain, things dry out really quickly, and then kaboom. I put in volcano, although anybody who knows anything about Ireland will know there's no active volcanism in Ireland. But believe it or not, it's a significant hazard because Iceland is located to the northwest of Ireland, and the prevailing winds have been known to carry ash from volcanic eruptions in Iceland over Ireland, which leads to no air traffic. And several years ago now, back in 2012-ish, you can check this out yourself, there was a major volcanic eruption in Iceland, which caused all flights across Europe, especially Ireland, to be cancelled for approximately 3 weeks. I know this because I was in Germany at the time and I couldn't get back to the US. Tsunamis. In the past, Ireland has suffered some significant tsunamis, and it will always have that risk caused by a variety of events offshore. And just like anywhere, Ireland experienced hazmat issues to do with typical industrial situation where there's an accident involving hazardous materials. And on the bottom you see CBRN, chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear and explosives. Ireland did actually experience a civil war of a sense where the north of Ireland went through the Troubles during the 1960s and 70s. And actually growing up in Ireland, I experienced that very much as a young child and as a teenager. So that has partly influenced my thinking about the teaching of terrorism, and not to take anything for granted, because it doesn't take much for civil situations to evolve into terrorist activities. So again, if you ever think I'm going too far, believe me, it actually comes from earlier experiences. But those events that I mentioned at the bottom also echo another thing, which unfortunately is in the news these days. When Chernobyl went through its disaster, again several years back, the prevailing winds carried radioactive materials across Europe, some of which landed or came to Ireland. So again, these are hazards that affect the country of Ireland. And when you look at these hazards, and apart from tsunamis, I guess, there's actually a reasonable similarity between what you can have in Ireland and Colorado. Now, when we look at forest fires, we know about that. And of course, the recent fires near Boulder really illustrate how that can impact populated areas. So, there. Anyway, let's let's tell you about civil defence. So, again, I mentioned that Ireland has a population of approximately 4.5 million people. And in Ireland, the Civil Defence Service has approximately 4,600 volunteers, which is 1 per 1,000, which is an interesting statistic, because if we were to compare that to Colorado, again, you can see the number of people we need to have in Colorado if we wanted to match what Ireland has. We have in Lakewood, for example, about 60 active members. The population of Lakewood is roughly 150,000 people, which means if we want to have 1 per 1,000, we need 150 active members in our CERT team. So there you go. If my math is wrong, correct me later. But I think I'm right. We could do with some more volunteers. How does civil defence actually operate? So to begin with, it's actually an organisation that's supported by the Irish government. If we were to make that similar to Colorado, we'd say the state government, because it would be easier to use that as comparison. And when I say supported, I mean in terms of finance and in terms of administration. So the Civil Defence Service actually gets funding through the Irish government and also through the Irish military. Now, civil defence members do not get arms. That's a no-go. So civil defence does not involve any form of defence training. It's just a way by which it's funded. So I believe 75% of its funding comes from the Irish military and 25% comes from the Irish government. So that's how it gets its funding. And as you'll see in a few moments, that money is spent, and you'll see how it's spent shortly. And so let's have a look at that. Any questions as we go through this? If there are, I'm happy to explain things. Maybe you're wondering what those lozengey, orangey things are over the map of Ireland. Every county in Ireland, there's 26 counties in the south of Ireland. The south being the Republic, the Irish Republic. So there's 26 counties. Every county has a civil defence unit. And those orange shapes represent the headquarters for every unit. There may be additional stations throughout the counties, but each county gets a headquarters. And as you'll see, there's other facilities as well. So you have a sort of a nice distribution of civil defence units throughout the country. Why they're distributed the way they are is more to do with the way the counties are organised as opposed to population centres. But that's what it looks like on paper. How did it all begin? So during the Second World War, Ireland was, and still is, funnily enough, a neutral country. But it didn't make any difference because during the Second World War, bombing raids coming from Europe and aimed at the United Kingdom or England and Wales and so on, sometimes because, in those times the technology was very basic. So flight crews would inadvertently end up over Ireland. And so Ireland did experience some occasional air raids and bombings that destroyed buildings and civilian locations like Dublin, for example. And there was a distinct awareness at the time that there was insufficient first responder capability to assist during an event that really pushed the first responders to their limits. So this was what really incentivized the government to reach out to the civilian population and get them involved so that they could assist first responders. To do that, they provided training to those civilians so that they would be able to safely go into areas that had been bombed and not just go in, also look for survivors, provide first aid, actually retrieve them from the rubble if they could, and so on and so forth. So you can see these are some photographs of early civil defence. These are civilian volunteers, but dressed almost as firefighters, putting out fires and engaged in heavy rescue, and also engaged in warning the population if an air raid was on its way. After the war finished, Europe the world entered into a Cold War, and the assumption was that if Ireland was ever impacted by a war that went warm or hot involving Europe, because again, the Irish government hopes that being a neutral country, Ireland would not be impacted directly by an attack, a nuclear attack. So the assumption was that Ireland would instead be the downwind beneficiary of fallout. And on the screen in front of you, you see the north of Ireland, where some projected nuclear sites were imposed or put on the map. So this was the attack pattern that was planned for if Ireland was to experience this sort of thing. And though I've used photographs of American civil defense radioactivity detectors, similar type machines and appliances were used in the Irish civil defence. So the concept was that civil defence in Ireland would assist in monitoring fallout as it was landing on Ireland during and after a nuclear war. Also, people were provided with training as to how to protect themselves and their families in the event of a nuclear war. So the book you see on the right comes from the 1960s. It was actually published the year I was born, in 1965. For those of you who didn't know how old I really was. And you'll see that book, Survival in the Nuclear War, Advice and Protection in the Home and on the Farm, reflecting the agricultural yen that Ireland has, at least did at the time. This was distributed to every household in Ireland and provided lots of information on what to do so as to be independent yet capable of working together. Any questions or thoughts on this as I hear some voices? Okay, I'll just continue on then. So let's talk about civil defence, because what began to happen is instead of just having an ad hoc structure of volunteers, the powers that be, the Irish government, structured civil defence into 6 core services, and that includes casualty service, rescue service, fire service, warden, communications, and welfare. And you see these 6 categories, and you probably were wondering, well, what are they for? Well, the idea is that if civil defence just taught one curriculum like we do in CERT, then specialisation would be difficult. So if somebody was really good at, say, first aid and wants to go beyond that, in civil defence, they join casualty service. That meant that when they'd arrive, you'd see from what they were wearing in their uniform what their skills were. Without even having to ask, you'd know straight away this person can really assist with medical treatment area if we put it into the CERT nomenclature. And I explain how the other services work. Well, I'll get to that in a moment because I have some slides that explain that. But what I'm going to do is just return to this. This was the original concept: 6 different services, all doing different things, but helping each other if needs be. And during the 60s and 70s and 80s, when I was a member, and then the 90s, this was how civil defence was taught, very much into these different core services and tons of hands-on training. And even though the name seems to suggest that they only did what they did, the reality was I was in casualty, I was in fire, I was in rescue service as examples. And at any time, if the phone rang, which in those days was only a landline, we didn't have any cell phones, you could be called upon to do a wide area search or look for a missing person or go into cliff rescue. And that could happen 24/7. And we would train every week for several hours, usually on an evening and usually in the rain. So they mentioned it rains a lot in Ireland. During the late 1990s, the Irish government was faced with a dilemma, because back in the 1960s in the United Kingdom, a decision was made to shelve civil defence. Unfortunately, the same thing happened in the United States. I'm not sure when that happened, but the point was that the civil defence organisations that occurred in those countries were disbanded. But in Ireland, a question was brought to the table of the Irish government: do we continue on with this? Because the old Cold War mentality of what would happen if there's a war in Europe, for some reason people began to think, well, that's very unlikely to ever happen. So they were thinking, should we get rid of it? Should we modify it? What can we do? And I suppose the fact was that at that time there were a lot of people trained in comparative civil defence. So instead of throwing out the bath with the baby, a decision was made to review what civil defence could actually do in a modern era and how that could be retooled to change and work with the modern country that Ireland had become. And just reflecting on the fact, as you have here in the North Central region in the state of Colorado, Ireland has really good first responder capability. So sometimes people make the excuse, oh, Ireland, it's like a third world country. They can't speak properly, and they have no technology. They only have S cards and that kind of stuff. It's not true at all. Ireland has become a very modern European country. These are some photographs of some of the first responder vehicles that are used, like the helicopter you saw on the opening screen. There's a fire truck, maybe slightly different shape and size to what you have here, but definitely very effective. There's an ambulance, paramedic ambulance, and there's a police car. So, they're pretty good. And responders in Ireland are
It's just a civil defense slide. There's no picture.
Oh, you can't see a picture?
I just see the civil defense. I don't see an ambulance or fire truck.
We've got it here. We've got the full screen. Oh, okay, Mark. Maybe there's something wrong on your side. Because can anybody else see the full screen right now with the helicopter and fire truck?
Yes, Declan.
Yes, I can, Declan.
Okay, Mark. I don't know what to tell you. Maybe I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll just attach this and send this to everybody who couldn't attend the meeting, and Mark, you can view it later if you'd like. If that's all right with you.
I'll just throw the phone out the window.
Oh, yeah.
I was going to say, Mark, you might want to log out and log back in, see if that helps.
Yeah.
Yeah, and by the way, when you're throwing out your phone, I'll pay you a visit. You can throw my phone with it because my phone is terrible. The new one I just got off.
That's horrible. Technology.
It's beyond horrible. It's terrible. So
okay, sorry.
No worries. Thanks for letting me know, though. Okay, so I just want to revisit this again. As we all know in CERT, we on occasion went up against pushback from first responders because they said to us, we've got everything covered here in the front bench. We got fire trucks, we got ambulances, we got everything. So if anything bad ever happens here, we have it covered. You guys can stay at home and do what you do. Yet in Ireland, a country of comparable size and population, with really good first responder capabilities, they've embraced civil defense, and instead they, as you'll see shortly, really put a lot of effort into supporting the civil defense organization, and you'll see how. And yeah, here we go. So this is what happened. In 2002, the Irish government passed the Civil Defense Act. Again, comparing this to the state of Colorado, it's as if the government of Colorado, the state government, decided to pass legislation that created a state CERT program and turned it into something that now was going to be supported at the state level, because that's what they did in Ireland. And this is what civil defense became. I put on the Mind the Gap, for those of you who are familiar with the London Underground, otherwise known as the Tube. There's this expression that's frequently blared out at stations: mind the gap, designed to encourage people taking the trains to not step between the train and the platform. But gaps, the word gap is important because what happened during the analysis phase, the government of Ireland figured out that first responders couldn't cover everything, despite their assertions that they could. And as we've seen here in Colorado, for example, when a major emergency occurs that pushes the first responders beyond their limits, there's just not enough firefighters, there's just not enough trucks, etc. That's when you need to call upon other agencies. If you don't have access to them, you're in trouble. Now, I know that here we have the National Guard, which is great. The National Guard is also a military organization that do other things. But if you have access to the civilian population, if they're trained, they can really step in. The second point, the river, lake, and coastal area search and recovery, as those of you who've taken the wide area search class can attest, that's when you really need people, a lot of people. When it's a large area, somebody's missing, multiple people are missing, maybe it's a tornado, maybe it's an earthquake. That's, again, when you really need a lot of people. Response to environmental problems, again, first responders are not necessarily trained in dealing with this because they're already on call for other things. Marketing, civil defense training, well, that's really not an emergency response. That's more about getting more people involved. And of course, flooding, which is a very labor-intensive task. I can go through these, but the point I'm making is that this whole activity list was based on working out, well, what do first responders actually do? Where could a civilian volunteer group fill gaps. And that's why in the following slides you'll see how things changed. So this is now when I go into the specific groups modified to reflect what happened in 2002. So you see the casualty service to begin with, and before you even go to the next slide, you'll see they're all wearing uniforms. That ambulance is a civil defense ambulance, and all the equipment is state of the art. It's not, secondhand stuff that you get out of a dumpster. It's actually provided for free to the volunteers as part of the service and part of their training. The search and rescue service, once again, involves not just uniforms, it also involves a lot of training in cliff rescues, cave rescues, wide area searches, use of drones, etc. So, once again, a lot of training. The fire service. Very unusual for the Civil Defence Fire Service in Ireland to be called upon to put out fires, funnily enough, but often called upon to assist with flooding, because that's something they're really good at dealing with, pumping water. So if you have a flooding event affecting a town or a city in Ireland, the Civil Defence are always involved, and they bring their fire trucks, as you'll see shortly. They don't have one or two, they have a lot. The warden service is something that really relates back to the older civil defence, where you have this continuous radiation monitoring service, and vehicles are provided. Scientific groups within civil defence are typically attracted to this, where they not just look for radiation in the field, but also monitor plume modelling and so on. And it lends itself also to environmental issues. So if you have a release of toxic material into the atmosphere, civil defence can be called upon to assist with warning people and so on of the plume and where it's going. Communication service. I know that John is probably listening with his ears up on this one. Irish Civil Defence is heavily involved, not just in ham radio, but also in other 2A radio systems, so as to ensure interoperability with first responders. So you can see, for example, there's a communications vehicle. The Civil Defence in Ireland has many of those. They're designed to be operations headquarters during civil defence activities. And they don't just include radios, they also include computers and so on, whatever is necessary. And this group is also the same group that in CERT we refer to as the Public Information Officer group, where they're trained to deal with the media. So if a civil defence event is occurring where they're being called out to assist, a civil defence PIO will be the person who speaks to the media on behalf of the responders. And then here's the welfare service. You see, civil defence covers all bases. Welfare is designed so that in the post-disaster environment, the responders and the people impacted by the disaster are clothed, housed, fed. You can see the training in the middle. This is actually the Civil Defence College in Ireland. Yes, they have their own college, where people are taught how to cook, also taught how to store materials for cooking, and of course the food itself, a lot of safety involved, and then how to deliver it to the hungry volunteers and the hungry survivors. So, I'm covering a lot of bases here in this evening's presentation, but as you're thinking about this, I hope it also draws your attention to, CERT post-disaster, what can CERT do? See, there's lots of things we often overlook, like, for example, the need to feed people and the need to make sure they don't get sick. You know how in Unit 4 we talk in Medical Part 2 about sanitation and ensuring that you stay healthy in a post-disaster environment. That's why welfare is so critical, to ensure that people are looked after mental health-wise, physical health, etc. And in addition, of course, there's this critical incident stress management, where the Irish government, knowing that civil defence volunteers are potentially going to be exposed to situations that may cause some traumatic stress, they provide free counselling and free support to any civil defence volunteer. So imagine you're a CERT volunteer, we get a deployment and we're involved with something where you are exposed to something that you wish you hadn't seen. It impacts you. Well, in Ireland, you get counselling for free for as long as you need it. I won't comment on what happens here, but there you go. This is what happens in Ireland. And I mentioned earlier that there's the Civil Defence College. Now, of course, FEMA does have the Emergency Management Institute in Maryland, which prior prior to COVID was accessible for anybody in the United States who was part of first responders, etc., could go there. But it took a lot of effort to get you there because it's in Maryland. In Ireland, the Civil Defence College is, remember again, the size of Ireland compared to the size of Colorado, compared to the size of the North Central region. This is right in the middle of Ireland, a place called Rosscray. So it's designed to be the place where all civil defence volunteers go to. There's no part of Ireland that's more than 2 hours drive from this place. And you can go there for a week or whatever. They provide all the training, all the accommodation for free, all the feeding for free. And they train instructors and so on and so forth, and more advanced response capabilities. Any questions or anyone weeping yet? Okay, can somebody just say that you can see what's on the screen, please?
Yes, I can see Civil Defence College.
Oh, thank you. Thanks so much, Mark. Okay. I just put this in so as to illustrate the fact that in civil defence, just like I've asked you guys when we're in exercises to put a stripe on the helmet for the team leader, in civil defence in Ireland, in fact, in civil defence internationally, ranks are normal, so that when people see civil defence volunteers, and these are all volunteer roles, by the way, the rank reflects experience and also reflects what you're doing in terms of that group that's responding. It's chain of command, no different from what you see in the fire service, police department, and so on. And the markings are what's worn on the shoulder epaulets, and it's also reflected in other parts of their uniform, like the helmet, for example. And in Ireland, I love this. This is what the top priorities of civil defence are: 1, volunteers; 2, volunteers; and 3, volunteers. They really do spend a lot of time supporting the volunteers because they want to make sure that people don't just leave after they've had a bit of training. So that's why so much effort is put into providing that social atmosphere whenever they can, so that they get the civil defence volunteers, when they're not in a deployment, to actually spend time together and have some fun. So that's something that's really, I think, magnificent. If I haven't covered it, actually I haven't. I just want to go back a step. I want to give you some insight into when we were looking at the casualty service and you saw those ambulances and so on. I just want you to be aware that if you join civil defence in Ireland, you're not just going to be taught first aid. In fact, if you want to, they'll bring you all the way through to advanced paramedic training. So you'll learn all the stuff that paramedics are normally trained in over here. It's all free. You don't get charged a penny for it. And in fact, many people in Ireland who want to become paramedics join civil defence and get their entire training while being a member. There's nothing to prevent them from leaving civil defence later, getting involved in a different service. But just be aware that paramedic qualification translates anywhere in Europe. So again, these are important things to know. That, the amount of time and investment that goes into civil defence is it's echoed in the type of training people receive. I believe the annual budget for civil defence in Ireland is roughly $5 million per year. Compare that to what we get. Very little. So $5 million per year for a group that's about 4,600 volunteers in a place the size of a small part of Colorado. So how do you keep the volunteers motivated and engaged? Well, firstly, you give them uniforms. I know that might sound trivial. Maybe not everybody agrees with that. But the point is that when you're part of something and you can see these people all marching for a St. Patrick's Day parade, there's a sense of unity. Again, not everybody buys into the concept of wearing a uniform, but I like to think that it does demonstrate to the people observing these guys that they're part of something different, and they're proud to stand together and proud to deliver a service basically as a volunteer. So that's one element of motivation. But there's more to it. There's also the training. If you show up and the training is terrible and the atmosphere is negative, you're unlikely to stick around. Whereas in civil defence, they really put a lot of effort into good training, good equipment. They 12-year-olds and 17-year-olds and 18-year-olds involved in life saving. So that's why they give these younger people uniforms. They teach them how to drive vehicles as soon as they can. They show them a lot of different skills, as I said, for a variety of different things. People get to know each other. There's quite a few civil defense members who ended up marrying each other. It's what they do. Knowing that they give back to their community for a lot of these members is great. And mentioning those teenagers, we know that in our communities, unfortunately, some teenagers fall between the cracks and they end up joining gangs and doing things of that nature. When I say respect here, it's amazing the transformation that occurs to teenagers in Ireland when they join civil defence. You know, they don't want to leave civil defence. They think it's fantastic fun. It's like being part of a club that never stops giving. I think the oldest civil defence member I've ever known was 87. He wasn't as active as he was when he was younger, but the point is it's a lifetime membership if you want to be part of it. And there's when people eventually get to, let's say, 25 years or 50 years in civil defence, they have a big party for these people, give them awards. So just wanted to share that, so that in case you want to stay in CERT for a period of time, we'll have to have a whip round and see if we can do something special for you. This is some of the examples of what civil defence do. I'm picking the 2014 numbers just because I accessed that online and that was what I could get. So again, compare Ireland to Colorado, compare 4,600 members to what we have here if we had a similar situation. Again, this is not exactly a direct comparison, but gives you an idea of if we were part of a CERT civil defence type group here, this is what you could expect. You know, the number of emergency responses is actually very minimal. As you can see, missing persons 67. Mind you, we had 0 last year, so I guess there's always a possibility of doing something there. But looking down the list, the one that really gets the number one position is sporting events. That's because, you know, if you think about it, if you can get a volunteer group who are really good at first aid and also really good at interacting with members of the community, that's why they really like to have civil defence presence at major, let's say, games, so that they can be there in case somebody gets hurt, or if you get a stampede, or if something bad happens. And so that's why there's such a large number of that, and it also keeps the members engaged, gets them involved in something where they put their uniforms on, their vehicles are operated, as you'll see in a moment. What I'm talking about, you really get teary when you see that. But that's kind of some of the stuff they do. And here's the list of the equipment. This is the national list, just to give you an idea of 2014. In a country the size of a third the size of Colorado, with a population similar to the population of the Denver metropolitan area and the surrounding cities, civil defence in Ireland has 104 ambulances, 47 fire trucks, 216 4x4 vehicles. Those special vehicles with the antennas and the radios, 19 of those, 61 minibuses, 12 canteens, and 88 boats. We have a trailer. There you go. Okay, so this is some examples of people doing things in civil defence. This is a flooding event where you can see one of the vehicles. You'll see a few more photographs of those shortly, but there they are deployed right beside first responders. There's a regular first responder fire truck in the background of the street in the bottom left, with civil defence folks helping putting on sandbags in front of storefronts. And you'll see some of those. There's a boat being used by civil defence folks, and they're wearing swift water rescue gear. It's another element of training that the civil defence provide in Ireland for free. That equipment is very expensive, yet there are civil defence members wearing it and assisting civilians who've been impacted by flooding. There you go. There's the water rescue portion of civil defence. Not just inland water, not just fresh water. The swift water rescue folks are on the left side and bottom right side. But also that top right picture is a near-shore rescue vehicle. What I mean by that is it's salt water, it's ocean. So those civil defence members are part of a response looking for a missing person who unfortunately is drowned or had been drowned at sea. And they're part of that response. Of course, we don't have ocean around Colorado, so I guess that's one gap that's unnecessary to worry about. But swift water rescue is something that we have a lot of needs for in our state. Here's an example of a missing person search where, as you see in the top left, civil defense actually has its own canine unit, so as to search for people using dogs. There's a command and control vehicle on the top, the canine unit in the top right-hand corner. A lot of folks in the bottom as they're getting briefed on where to go for a missing person search. And yes, civil defense uses drones as well, because that's what you do when you're actually using technologies to search for somebody. There's some more canine unit seeing how they interact with the boats as well as with their handlers. Typically the handler looks after the dog. And by the way, on the top right, you'll see that individual wearing a civil defense uniform. This is what they look like. So again, rather pleasant looking uniform with epaulets on top with ranks, and all provided for free by the Civil Defense Organization. During COVID, Civil Defense was called upon very quickly to provide that additional support to the Irish population, I guess, because there just wasn't enough first responders. And to be honest with you, they weren't really trained to fill that gap at all. So that's why Civil Defense was called upon. And this is just a snapshot because this isn't out of date, but it's between March 17 and July 14 of 2020, I believe. So it really is out of date. At that time, 878 volunteers had been involved, a lot of time spent, a lot of taskings involved. And those vehicles that we mentioned earlier were being well used. And the taskings would have probably included delivery of medications, delivery of food, especially to people who were unable to leave their homes. During the shutdown, similar to the one that we had here, people were encouraged not to leave home and instead just to call a hotline and Civil Defense would deliver food to them. And we're talking about people who maybe couldn't afford to go and purchase food. Again, this was all covered because this is what the Irish government wanted to do for the people at a time when there was no other opportunity, no other choice. Here's some other examples of the COVID response, and you can see that the need for blood remained in place during the pandemic and still does. Pandemic hasn't stopped, in case you think it has. So the Civil Defense Organization was used to support the blood draws. You'll see, again, some of these volunteers using forklift trucks. Yeah, they have those too, by the way. But loading materials onto the back of their vans for distribution. A combination of food, and at the bottom left you can see food deliveries going out to members of the civilian population. And there's an ambulance, civil defense ambulance, in the bottom right. We're not talking about some 1960s era, white van that's been modified to look like an ambulance. We're talking about a state-of-the-art ambulance, typical civil defense issue ambulance, being decontaminated after having transported a person who had COVID. Because Civil Defense Casualty Service were actually doing that. They were working side by side with the regular ambulance people and for patient transport. So again, that training was allowing them to do that safely. So that's about as much as I'm going to tell you about civil defense, but I'm more than happy to have a chat and to go into further detail. So with that, I'm going to stop the presentation. Is there any questions before I do that, or shall I just go back down to the regular meeting again?
Hey boss, it's Kay. You say that they're all volunteers, but for those folks who stay a lifetime, like the 87-year-old you were mentioning, is there some kind of I don't know, security, social security, if you're in there that long?
Yeah, there is. Firstly, there is an opportunity, but it's a very minor one, for I think 1 or 2 people per county. There's only 26 counties to become employees. They would become civil servants effectively, who are involved in the management of civil defense at a county level. So they'd have to go through the county and then get employed by the county. So again, if we were to look at, let's say, the North Central region, you'd be talking about several people would be employed within the North Central region on a full-time basis to manage CERT or civil defense. But for the people who stay forever in civil defense, you would receive additional benefits as a result of being a member of civil defense, both in terms of pension and health benefits. For example, you would have enhanced health support Ireland has a very different system of health protection that we have over here. And I'm not trying to get political, but I just mentioned that in Ireland, it being they have a slightly different perspective on people. So what happens in Ireland is everybody is covered by the health service in Ireland. But if you're a civil defence member, I suppose it's fair to say that it's guaranteed that if you get hurt while being a volunteer, you'll get immediate treatment or quick treatment. It won't cost you a penny. That's key to this. You don't get charged for this stuff. You may pay higher taxes, but the fact is that you'll be covered by that safety net. I don't know if that answers your question precisely, but the point is that I think people volunteer for other reasons. They usually, more or less every civil defence volunteer has another occupation of some sort, but they enjoy it so much that they'll put in the time as they have it to be part of civil defence. I hope that helps resolve your question. Any other questions?
Perfect, thanks.
Yeah, you want to move to Ireland, don't you? Yeah, on March 17th, St. Patrick's Day, the special day for applying for Irish residency. Just that's what they do on St. Patrick's Day. Just kidding.
Okay, Declan?
Yeah.
It's interesting what you're presenting to it. Very interesting to me. The similarities between there and what we had going out here. We're talking about the early times of it. I was a shelter manager, and I was a radiological monitor and stuff during the 60s. Mm-hmm. That's when civil defense out here was very strong to it. They did drop the official part of it, but many of the cities and the counties and stuff kept an active form of civil defense going to manage all those things. We wasn't quite sure the war was over. The Cold War was going to be over. So we continued it for some time. But what it morphed into was we took, in the small towns and such like that, you had all volunteers for the fire department, for to assist the sheriff, and to do and then in those days there wasn't much of an ambulance, let's put it that way. What we had was a scoop and run type of operation to get it to it. So now it's morphed up into in the big cities, and then spreading out into the smaller ones to it. Yeah, we have the big paramedic ambulances and everything else to it. But a lot of that up until a few years ago, still a lot of stuff was volunteer. We didn't start getting paid people in until, except in the big cities. We'd have the chief or one of those others, paid ones that managed, just like you said, for years to it. So that's what they brought that along to. So somewhere in that part to it, it's good to sit there and see CERT come in and try to come in to do this. We had React, which was on CB radio a lot to it, and we managed all kinds of things off of that, including weather watch teams and such to it. It was on that part to it. So you had a more consolidated one to it over there, which is really nice. And I'm envious. We got that over there. But we have spread it out more over here in the United States to it. And it's still active in a lot of things. If you go into the small towns and such like that, you're going to find a very dedicated group of volunteers there and running to it. And they get some special funding for equipment and stuff to it. But they're like everything else. They're always just a little bit of a lag behind them in the big cities and what they can set and do. So it's interesting very much. Thanks for all of that.
It's a pleasure. I think my observation, by the way, I've lived here for 22 years. And this is my home, I guess. But I like to refer to that because it provides one with a perspective of what a different part of the world, a different country, how they provide civilians with an opportunity to support first responders and to support the broader community in the event of something that exceeds the first responder capability, but help is still needed. And clearly in Ireland, one could maybe argue it's a smaller country, therefore it's easier to, in that size area, to have a uniform system. But I continuously come back to what we have here in, let's say, the Front Range or in the state of Colorado. Often we forget because everybody's using the internet every 2 minutes or getting in your cell phone. But often we forget the nearest big city of comparable size to Denver is Salt Lake City. So if we have a big incident here that involves lots of stuff needed here now. Salt Lake City is a ways away, and if it has to come by truck, and there's lots of other issues going on here. We are kind of in an island. I know that you can drive, but the fact remains that in terms of isolation, this is a population center that has a lot of miles between it and the next big population center. So it's just not a bad idea, I think, to enhance civilian support or civilian training and to provide a civil defense-like group here. And that's why I see some strong opportunities here if we were to broaden our CERT training and enhance CERT training and so on. But that also, there's another aspect to this which I should also say. First responders here are typically professionals. It's definitely in the front range. Professional fire, professional paramedics, etc. In Ireland, the fire service is all run by the counties. They're all civil servants. The paramedics are all the emergency paramedics are all provided by the National Health Service in Ireland. So both of those are government agencies. So when it comes to competition, we're not dealing with competitive situation between a private company and a group of volunteers. Whereas here, of course, we run into that hurdle. So that is probably one of the reasons why you don't see a great push on the first responder side for more volunteers to provide support, because maybe they may think this may represent a threat to their business. And that's a shame, because civilians don't care who the help comes from on a bad day. They just want help. And if we could navigate a way to avoid creating that impression to the first responder companies and say, look, our role is not to step on your toes, our role is to fill gaps that unfortunately you're not capable of filling at the moment, maybe you will in the future. I think that would be a very logical way forward. But that takes a lot of effort, and it also takes governmental support at the state level if we ever want to go in that direction. So I'm glad to hear from you, John, that volunteerism continued on where you are, and I'm also very pleased to have you involved with our group as well, of course. Somehow or another we can see a way forward. Anybody else has any comments or questions on the presentation? Any other thoughts? In case you're wondering, this is the book. Now, I don't know if it's reversed because it's reversed on my screen. Is that writing reversed on yours? It's not reversed on your screen? It's okay. This word is BAS with an A. It's longer. Yeah, it's pronounced boss, and this is Baha. And if I turn around, it's actually the same document that you saw. Again, it's reversed on my screen. And this is the book that was handed out in the 1960s, telling you how to survive a nuclear attack in Ireland. Great to have in your back pocket. This is a more recent version of the same book, which was provided, again, the harp on the top confirms it's produced by the Irish government. These are freely available, by the way, from Ireland, but you have to go through a process if you want to order them. But if you want to do that, let me know and I'll see what I can do. They provide tons of information on, again, what to do and how to protect yourself. But that was, as I said, the original core function of civil defense, so as to provide people with the materials that they could refer to if ever they were impacted by a nuclear war. And of course, as I've also said, from 2002 onwards, civil defense has morphed into a volunteer support group that also has that nuclear capability, but it's well hidden. They didn't get rid of it; they just hid it away under the warden service, and it remains in place. I guess they felt, maybe it could happen, so why not keep the capability? Any more thoughts or comments on this?
I got one more thing in here, Declan, just to say to it. You mentioned amateur radio to it. Yeah. There is a very tight group of all volunteers. We never take monies for anything to it, and we're not hired or anything to it. We do work a lot of times under the auspice of professionals and such to it and coordinate with them to it. But yeah, you'll sit there and see big communication vans come in and pick up with it to it. We bring in our own food and support and stuff to it. And we're closely allied with like the Salvation Army to it, to provide them communications and spread out to it, and then they provide the foods and stuff to it. So they're all volunteers. So really, there's a whole lot of volunteerism around here. It's just got under different names than maybe what all the professionals have kind of overshadowed.
Totally agree, and I'm very impressed with what I've seen and what I experience on a regular basis here. So I don't in any way imply that there is no volunteerism here. I agree completely with you. There are other forms of volunteerism that exist here, but I do want to reflect on the fact that in the civil defence in Ireland, it's like a single umbrella served by all this service under that group, and the funding is all directed into that group and then distributed to the different capabilities. It just makes it a little bit easier.
Yeah, and we certainly do appreciate your views on that. That's why we're here with you.
Yeah, at the end of the day, if there's a bad day, we're all here for the same reason. It doesn't make any difference what color our helmets are. We're going to try and help as much as we can. So that's the deal. Okay. Any other comments or concerns or questions, maybe? Just going to check. Okay, there's nothing in the chat. Okay, so maybe I'll just move on to another thing quickly, because I'm not intending to make tonight's meeting that long. But I just wanted to reach out and let you all know that next week I will not be physically present in Lakewood. I will be in Pueblo. I'm actually delivering a G141 class, which is a FEMA class on presentation, how to deliver presentations, and it's being delivered at the Pueblo Office of Emergency Management. It's an official FEMA course. I happen to be a state instructor, so I can do these things. But if any of you are interested in G141 and would like to learn more, go online and you'll see what the curriculum entails. And we might be able to do something similar for our CERT program in the future. Mind you, it is a 3-day class, and it's 24 hours. So if we want to do that, we're going to have to put our sleeves up and figure out how to schedule that one. But the reason I'm mentioning it this evening particularly is because next Wednesday, we have a scheduled face-to-face in-person meeting at West Metro. So I'm uncertain at the moment as to how we should proceed with that meeting. And would anybody on this evening's meeting like to suggest what we could do?
Have you talked to Rich about it?
I haven't talked to Rich yet, which however I will do. And I have no doubt whatsoever that you're referring to Rich Coulter, of course, that he may be interested in hosting that meeting. So I'll reach out to him after this meeting, and I'll cede control of that meeting to him. So don't worry, I'm not into authoritarianism. I know that it seems to be the fashion in other parts of the world these days, but that's not me. Anybody that thinks I am is thinking about the wrong person. So if he wants to host that meeting next week, so be it, and I would really encourage that. And if he is, make certain that he is given plenty of support, and also demand the best. Okay, you don't want anything less than the best. So I'll chat with him and see what he wants to do. Okay. Beyond that, also, I'm very keen to get more people involved with the management of Lakewood CERT. My time is increasingly being impacted by non-CERT events, and I'm recognizing that if we don't get volunteers, you guys or others who are not into this evening's meeting, to step up and become part of the organization and actually, take on some additional responsibilities, then we're going to find that we just can't have the same level of training, etc. Now, of course, before I go another step, with COVID, our training really was pulled back a lot. So we also lost our training venue, which has not been resolved yet, in case any of you were thinking, well, when are we going to do our next CERT class? I just want to let you know, as a follow-up to the meeting before last, I said we were on the cusp of getting a venue. Hasn't happened yet. Still working on it. But once that does happen, I really would like to move back into a lot of training. But just want to let you know, I need your help on this. I need people like John and Robert and Mark and Coral and Kay and everybody else, and Shauna and Kurt and anybody who's on this call. You all have to see yourselves as potentially people who can make this happen. Because unfortunately, I can't do it myself as much as I'd like to. I have to have help, and things have changed. Some of the people who were very active have left or are leaving, and some of the people who are part of this group, if you have some time at all, it could be a great time to get involved. There's no pushback. I need help. So anybody that thinks I'm going to say no is you're thinking of the wrong person again. I need all the help I can get. So if you would like to become more involved in some capacity, please reach out to me and we can have a chat. I know, Robert, you want to do some more. And, I owe you a call. we will chat about that one. But in terms of needs are included administration. We're planning for logistics a full stock take of all our equipment. See you, Kurt. I'll talk to you later. Thanks.
So anyway, guys, that was the meeting. So please don't forget to rate, comment, subscribe, and click the notification bell so you never miss an upload from me. This has been Kurt Yowell at CYowell at Gmail, CYowell.cert@gmail.com. I will post my email in the description. Just real quick here. I'll probably do that after I end the video though. So see you guys.